Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. This podcast explores how authors create a world that we can escape into. Join me as we demystify the magic that keeps us turning the page. Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. Today, I'm speaking with Vanessa Beaumont, whose poignant, immersive, and heartbreaking novel, The Other Side of Paradise, tells the story of a family torn apart by the restraints of inheritance and the rigid rules imposed on them by a society that refuses to acknowledge the truth. This story takes us to Britain between the wars. England is decimated by World War I, but the upper classes are still trying to cling on to social conventions. Lunches, teas, and dances carry on as if nothing has happened, as if no one is scarred. Enter Jean Buckman, a young, naive American debutante whose father is the American ambassador to England and whose mother, Elizabeth, is fabulously wealthy with, quote, more money than God. Elizabeth Buckman is very ambitious for her daughter to marry well. Jean ends up pleasing her mother by marrying Edward Ware, a handsome, complicated, repressed Englishman, full of scars, and the owner of an important, now falling apart estate in the north of England. The marriage falters, and Jean ends up buying a house in the south of France as a place to escape to in the summer. There, she meets a dashing writer and has a passionate affair that will have ramifications for the rest of her life. Vanessa, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you.
And where are you speaking from now? Are you in London or up north?
Sadly, not up north. I'm in London, so we are in London for the sort of term time and work, really, but Northumberland is where we are holidays, where our heart really is.
Exactly. Yes, I read your story in House and Garden, which I'll bring up later. Anyway, I guess a good place to start with The Other Side of Paradise is your inspiration. I believe the seed to this novel starts with 2 de Laszlo portraits. Can you tell us about that?
That is correct. So we were staying with friends in his beautiful house in Hampshire, and in the dining room they had a series of these de Laszlo portraits. So he was a society portrait painter of that moment of the sort of early 20th century. And in this particular dining room, there were 2 portraits that really caught me. One of a woman with her 2 sons, and there was definitely a sort of something in her look that made me think all was not quite sort of perfect. And then the partner to that portrait, interestingly, was not really one of her husband, but it was of her mother, this very formidable looking grande dame of an American woman. And I asked our host whose house it was, I said, can you tell me a bit about them? And they said, oh, well, that is the mother of the bride. And this house and this estate you're sort of, having luncheon was the wedding gift from this American mother on the marriage of her only daughter. I thought, wow, that's quite a kind of wedding gift, and fascinating. And these friends of ours whose house it were, we started talking about it. And interestingly, they had a little family archive. And I began to sort of go through that and see whether there was more about this particular family, a sort of a factual book that I could write. And frustratingly, there wasn't enough. Her diaries were very limited. And I kind of thought, oh God, I don't know, this is not the book I want to write. And then I began to think, what would I have wanted the story to be? What would I have wanted that lady with the sort of mournful look with her 2 little boys? What did I want that story to be? And what was her mother like? And that was really the beginning of the novel, this sort of the journey for me of that story.
And were you thinking when you couldn't find anything in the archives that you were going to write a nonfiction?
Yes, I was, which at the time felt like the safer option, because I think when you're writing a nonfiction book, to submit to publishers, you just write your proposal, you can do 2 sample chapters. It's not such a commitment, really. So I was very wary about writing. It felt sort of dangerous to start sort of thinking about writing. And I thought, I can't write fiction. And actually, this sort of brick wall that I got to with the de Laszlos was so helpful, because it really pushed me to think, well, hang on, there's a story I want to write, and it's not the one that exists. And can I do this? And I actually really remember the moment, because I had a sort of really, in reality, this woman whose archives I looked into, her mother had ended up buying her a house in the south of France. There were little sort of nuggets But again, there was nothing really to kind of meaty to the story that made it. I didn't even know if their marriage was happy or not. And I thought, God, I'm going to have a house in south of France that's going to be the kind of fulcrum of this whole relationship, is going to be this someone she meets in South France, and had a very strong vision of a scene when she's saying goodbye to this house somehow. And I sat in the library I used to research in, and I just wrote this scene, shut my laptop, went back the next day and read it again. And I was an editor by trade, and I'm very critical. And I went back over it and I was like, oh, okay, it's readable. So I carried on writing a kind of outline for this story and working on the kind of novel idea, but was very, very nervous about doing it, because I really, having been in publishing, know the kind of massive risk in writing fiction, that it never sees the light of day, or it does, but it fails, all these things. But I overcame those anxieties.
And in your vision, so you saw her saying goodbye to the house.
Yes. So I knew, I had this real sense that if this woman was going to marry into an English family, and this English family was going to be repression and somehow about duty and things, and this place in France was going to be the opposite of that. And this all grew as the story. It's amazing how stories sort of get a life of their own, and in your head it grows and grows. But I sort of felt like that the choice was going to be that she wouldn't be able to go with, freedom and liberation, and actually reality would come knocking at the door, which makes it the kind of sad, dramatic story that it is, I suppose.
That it is.
Yeah.
It's very sad and very good. Can you tell us about the period between the wars, 1920 to 1939, roughly, and why it's so fascinating?
Well, that is interesting too, because when I looked at these real characters and then wanted to shift it to my own, the kind of dollar princesses that Jean Buckman could be considered one of, who sort of Edith Wharton wrote about, and the buccaneers who came along in the late 1890s and married into English families. I actually found that period of history far less interesting than this period post First World War. So I shifted it forward and made my character arrive into a London of 1921. And that is, for me, a really fascinating period of time, because particularly the English aristocracy, the First World War had absolutely decimated the sort of officer class, the aristocracy, really, because it was those who were killed. So in these big English families, the eldest son, the heir, even the person inhabiting the estate or whatever, owning the estate at the time, were just knocked out by war. So there was this whole sort of fragile situation where these great estates, these great houses, had lost the natural incumbent or the natural heir. And I think that made the character of Edward War quite interesting, because it's his older brother was meant to inherit it. He was the sort of golden boy who was at Oxford and was brilliant and charming and all these things. And he had been killed at Passchendaele. And it's his younger brother who inherits in his place. And that was a very real phenomenon, that a lot of these boys who were left behind, who were too young to have fought, were completely overshadowed by these older brothers and uncles and fathers who died in this horrific massacre in Europe. And they were left always to be slightly dismissed by the older generation. Oh, you didn't know, you never fought, you don't understand. And so that kind of led in one sense to that bright young things idea of the 20s, where they were like, well, sod it, we couldn't prove ourselves, so we're going to go out and drink and dance. And, or in the case of Edward War, I think it made for quite a screwed up generation of young men who didn't feel they had earned their position or the world they had inherited. So I found that period very interesting, really, to explore.
I didn't realize. So his name is pronounced War, not Rare. That's quite good.
Yeah.
And then you had another war.
Yes, exactly. And that is exactly that sort of sandwiching of a kind of youth. So someone like Jean or Edward, the sort of characters, that they grew up in that period, really, where just as they're coming up for air, then you have the rumblings of sort of the move to the right in the late 30s. And I thought, again, with the south of France and my characterization of that enabled you to see the kind of things on the turn. It was all looking wonderful and dreamy in the south of France, and suddenly, hang on, David, the writer, is beginning to say, well, it's not all dreamy, and Hitler's coming knocking at the door, and real life is coming. And I really enjoyed being able to explore that period. It's really fascinating.
And also you write about the south of France, how it got discovered in the 20s, in the early 20s. So it was very different than it is now. And it was really
a
place for writers and artists.
Yes, and that was very interesting because actually it's a part of the world I know really well. I've been to in the summer for many years with my family and then with my then boyfriend, now husband, and our family things. And I never knew that until I started researching that really up until the 20s, it had been a place where the sort of society spent really the winter. So they'd sit out the winter in places like Monte Carlo and then leave when it got too hot in April. And then this group instead of writers and artists, avant-garde, so your Scott Fitzgeralds and Hemingway, and that there's a sort of famous American couple, Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who
Did he write about them, or are they characters?
So they're sort of, the story is that in Tender is the Night, Scott Fitzgerald sort of put the knife into them. So they were a kind of wealthy couple. She was the heir to, this is where you might have to pronounce me on my pronunciation. Is it the Weiburg Empire? Anyway, she had both
I should know.
Husband and wife had a lot of money. But they were a bit kind of bored by conservative prohibition America. So they came to France and cultivated with their money this lovely world where writers like Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald could be, and Picasso was part of their group. And they essentially stuck around when the heat came and totally redefined the Riviera that we know now. So the Hotel du Cap, that's now Eden Rock, was a little hotel that, beautiful hotel, but that would shut in March when all the wealthy left. And Gerald and Sarah Murphy and this whole gang said, well, can we persuade you to keep it open? And the owner said, fine. And that was really the beginning of, which is sort of extraordinary to think about now, really, when you think
God,
of
how wonderful it must have been.
Yeah, I agree. And cheap. That was the other thing. It was incredibly cheap.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Not like now.
Not like now.
I loved both mothers in the story in terms of character. They're strong, stubborn women focused on maintaining their reputation and place in society above all else. Can you tell us about Elizabeth Buckman and Alice Warr, Edward's mother, and how they differed and how they were quite similar?
I think what was interesting to me about Elizabeth Buckman was that actually, in the beginning, you could almost see her as quite a benign force. She had this perfect daughter. She had aspirations for her daughter who doesn't, that sort of thing. And actually, they weren't total Aravis. She had generations of money. She was just, making the next move. But what I found interesting to explore, if that's not a sort of spoiler alert, is actually all of her niceness depended on things going her way. And in a way, that's sort of, I found that more brutal than the kind of icy cold Lady War doesn't really change. She is, and there are, multiple examples in novels and in real life of that kind of very cool English woman of a certain type for whom emotion is like, she's sort of slightly revolted by emotion, isn't she? And
weakness.
Yes. But I think they both share that similarity, which I think is probably a sign of the times and a horror of sort of change, is of oversharing, and that you are who you are. You are your society portrait, and don't you dare ever reveal that there's an inner life, beneath. No one cares. And I think that's quite interesting now because we are in the generation of a world of sharing. I think we actually need a dose of going back with the Buckmans and maybe not sharing so much.
Exactly. I was going to ask you if you could read from your book, just from the very beginning, to give readers a sense of your lovely writing.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is the very beginning. So this is part 1, chapter 1. London, 1921. When Jean looked back on those first few months in London, the prevailing emotion was one of embarrassment. Embarrassment at the attention she received each time she entered a room. Embarrassment at the number of eyes always upon her. The piercing eyes of mothers and grandmothers, making a quick calculation of her possible impact on their children's lives, appraising her height, her waist, weight of silk and turn of ankle. Embarrassment at the curious eyes of her female contemporaries. Would she be friend or foe? Would she bring a breath of fresh air to a room that had long seemed stifling to them? And the men, young and old alike, taking in her dark hair, her slim build, strong nose and angular face, her fine-boned hands. All those eyes knowing exactly who she was, who her parents were, who her grandfather was, what her extraordinary, near-perfect prospects were. It had all felt so embarrassing. Her parents had arrived a full 6 months before her father taking up his post as American ambassador to the court of St. James, her redoubtable mother Elizabeth by his side. Jean had merely to arrive and be introduced. The introductions had started as she stepped off the damp, carpeted gangplank on Southampton docks to find herself greeted by the awkward young man from the embassy. He put out his hand, barely making eye contact, as he directed her trunks and bags to the car, opening doors and giving instructions to the various attendant staff as he went. Not too choppy on the way over, I hope, he asked, but he didn't wait for an answer, continuing to mutter comments about the weather, addressed to no one in particular. When they had settled into the back of the car, however, he seemed to relax, his relief palpable in its steamy fog. His task had been accomplished, and Miss Jean Buckman of 455 Madison Avenue, New York, would be safely conveyed to her parents' ambassadorial residence without incident. The Buckmans had chosen not to make their home in the usual official residence of the American ambassador, but that was not quite large enough for the scale of her mother's ambitions. Rather, they had decided upon a grand private palace on Park Lane. The president had, of course, given this decision his blessing, and her mother's offer had been impossible for the owner of the house to refuse. And that was Elizabeth Buckman's way. Always to achieve one's ends, with an unbending charm, and the surety of limitless finances to smooth away any tiresome impediments. And so Jean had found herself living in a vast Riviera palazzo facing Hyde Park, with 4 large drawing rooms, countless smaller ones, not 1 but 2 libraries of note, a ballroom of considerable scale, and enough bedrooms to allow her parents to host each and every visiting dignitary, and quite possibly the president himself. Jean had heard it said that by the time the clock in the entrance hall chimed 9 in the morning, her mother already knew which Americans of import were in London and arranged for their appearance at her elegant chinoiserie salon within the hour. Jean knew that she was even more of a commodity here than she had been in New York. She could feel the weight of it the first Saturday to Monday she spent in a picturesque Queen Anne house that sat proud and perfect amid the manicured slopes of a Hampshire estate, its gardens a Repton delight, each room giving on to a peerless aspect of English Arcadia beyond. She could sense the anticipation of the house as her parents' car had snaked down the drive to be presented by the tableau of servants awaiting their arrival. She had heard the fussing of the hostess as she was ushered inside by the butler, had blushed at the fanfare with which she was introduced to their only son, who stood awkwardly at the bottom of the grand staircase, waiting for the gallows. That night at dinner, she looked down a table groaning with silver, polished by a silent army of gloved hands, a chorus of censorious family portraits standing sentinel above. The portly gentleman to her right, cheeks mottled with drink, leant in. "My dear, you're quite the guest. I've dined at Appington more than 20 times, but never have I seen Lady Danby use the serve." He looked across the table to his hostess and smiled at her benignly, before dabbing at the corners of his mouth with his napkin and dropping his voice. "They've sold at least half of the estate already, and there's an attic sale planned for next week, which they've tried to keep out of the papers, but of course we all know about it. Clearing things out for young Alexander, as Lady Danby put it to me earlier, with a valiant attempt at nonchalance. Maintaining the facade of the charmed English life can be an exhausting occupation. Her hair has gone quite grey from the effort."
Your descriptions are so good of London and Harrop, pronouncing it correctly, Harrop, and the south of France. Was it quite easy for you to get it? So these details, I mean, was it research, a lot of research, but also, or did you just, it's the way you write, it just comes naturally?
I think a combination. So I set the house, Jean's house, Harrop, or Edward's house, Harrop, I intentionally set in the north because it is an area I know really well, and it's where our house is. And I wanted to feel, it made sense to the story, but also I really wanted to feel confident that in its descriptions, I felt that I was right. And actually, it's the same with the south of France. I didn't have to go there to write it when I sat and wrote. I wrote in the London Library, which is the lovely little members' library in Mayfair. And I could call to mind the colours, the sounds, because I've been there every summer since I was born.
Wow.
But the detail was definitely research. And actually, I love research. I love a library. I love, it's such an interesting period to me that it didn't feel like homework. It felt really fascinating. Right. So I hope it was there was an emotional connection to all the locations that makes it a bit more genuine. But behind it, there was quite a lot of grind of checking and...
Yeah, no, it's terrific. Now you had that minor character, Jean's Aunt Elaine, a somewhat scandalous divorcee, who was one of the few people to speak the truth to Jean early on in the book. Can you tell us a little bit about Aunt Elaine? I think she only appears once.
Yeah. I think I felt very strongly that someone needed to sense that she was sort of sleepwalking into disaster. I mean, one would hope that it wouldn't be disaster, but as the reader, you think, this is not looking good. These two people, they're young and so naive. And so I really wanted this sort of world-weary, wise woman. And initially, I actually thought it would be a kind of girlfriend, a kind of Kit Kennedy character who might have come to London and knew a bit more about life. And then I thought, actually, I quite like the idea of it being an older woman, and particularly someone who really annoyed her sister-in-law, Elizabeth Buckman, which was a nice little detail, I thought, by the fact that she was a divorcee and all of that. And it sort of reminded me of those kind of characters in Edith Wharton, like in The Age of Innocence, the older women in those who might speak the truth a bit. And I thought that was a nice sort of character to weave in. Yeah.
And also on rereading it, it was a great foreshadowing about Elizabeth.
Exactly. That terrible moment in her drawing room in New York when she turns is,
very cruelly. Let's talk about setting as character. You wrote in an article for House and Garden about a house that you inherited, which became a character that you fell in love with, as opposed to what happened to Jean with Harrop. Can you explain?
Yes, you'll note that I sort of dedicated the book to my husband because I felt that I had created this world of the cold north with this sort of house of empty heart and things. And actually, I've had a very different experience. But what my experience did teach me, and I think was this idea of houses as characters. And I think I'm very aware, and I think it's definitely in literature, it's there, but I think I feel it very strongly myself, and I saw it in our house, that houses have chapters like lives have chapters. And I think the different chapters leave a sort of memory behind. And I certainly felt, so we took on what was my husband's grandfather's house. So he never actually grew up there. But when we took it on, it had literally hadn't been lived in for 15 years, been boarded up, the paintings were all in crates. And so when I first saw it when I was younger and before I was even married, and we'd go and have a look at it, I couldn't imagine a life to it. And actually, once we opened it up and started making it our own, I got this sense of a life that had been there before. And it turned out that in the 20s and 30s, it had been hugely busy, and the sort of great-grandparents had been really social. And I kind of got that as if we'd blown out the kind of dead air, and in had come the memories of sort of happiness and other things. And it really made me think that houses do have chapters, and they have a life, and they have a spirit, and something to sort of react against, and in Jean's case, I think. But I hope with Harrop in the novel that whilst it's not a place of happiness for her, she has a respect for it, and I think an understanding of its place in her life. And I think even the two boys, there's a moment when they're picked up from school and they go back after the holidays. Do you remember? And there's a sort of bit of silence before they suddenly all see it. They're coming up the drive and they all sort of react to it. And I think it can become a very significant thing in a family and in one's life as a house. It's a person, really, for better or worse. It can be a liability. It can be all sorts of things,
Yeah. I think the boys loved it.
Yes,
it was home
where
for
they
them.
grew up. Yes, exactly, home. But it was quite sweet. I thought that in the war, when it was requisitioned and they were only in this little bit, that they loved that even more in a way, which was quite touching.
Just the three of them.
Yeah, exactly.
And then in contrast, you've got the south of France. I loved you wrote, a burgeoning world of artists and writers where lavender runs riot on a lawn that runs down to the sparkling Mediterranean below. So a totally different character.
Yes.
And then I was sort of wondering ultimately where you thought Jean ends up. Like, where is home for her?
I mean, I think in a sort of, it's and you touched on how sad it is, and it is really sad. I think what I sort of tried to get across is that ultimately home for her is what's inside. It's those boys. It's that life she created, and ultimately, I don't want to ruin it, whatever. But that is. I
know I was trying to.
So yes. So Harrop was the house in the north. The big house is represents duty and responsibility, and the south of France is freedom and liberation and what might have been. But actually, the kind of resolution is, and I think maybe it's true of all of us. So that's why I quite like that you see the whole of her adult life. Really, is that we are the lives we lived and the stories we kind of carry within us. And as a mother, it sort of became quite a lot about motherhood, really. And I had at the time was having children and things, that, you know, you carry so much within you that maybe that is your story.
Mm-hmm.
So that was what I was sort of trying to aim at.
Yeah, right. Home was kind of within her.
Yes, I think so. And there's that bit when she sails across the Atlantic to go and see her mother. And she feels very sort of adrift, and she doesn't quite know where she belongs. And I think that sort of summed up her, that she was very much a person who everyone knew who she was on paper, and she didn't know who she was inside. And that's really what the journey of the book is, working out, for better or worse, with a lot of hiccups and missteps and things, who she actually is.
Yeah. I heard you say in an interview that you found writing the endings to chapters was really hard. I was wondering, was writing the ending of the book hard?
Yes, it was. And in fact, again, it's hard to talk about it without spoiling it, but there was an ending I wanted to write because it was nicer.
Oh.
And then,
darn.
And actually it was still quite dark, but marginally less dark. And then my editor said, have you thought about seeing it through? And I actually remember I got real goosebumps, and I was like, I knew that was what I needed to write. And I went away and changed it slightly. And actually I didn't find it hard. What's strange is actually in the rewriting of the ending, my father had died, and also we had sold our house where I grew up, a sort of country house where I had grown up, but but in a strange way, it helped me write the last bit, because in it, she goes back to the house in the south of France, and it's empty of things, but it's crammed with her memories. And I had, in that period, we'd sold the house, and I remember with my brothers, suddenly this house we'd had all our life. Yeah. Done all the boxes. And it's so strange being in an empty house that is just everywhere you look, you see, oh my God, that was me when I was 8 doing this. And that was where me and my brother fought. And this is where me and my mum sat the night before I got married, all these things. And I think that actually helped me feel that the ending I was writing was quite true. And that's quite satisfying as a writer, to feel like you're tapping into a truth, even if it's only a truth for yourself.
No. That's a good point. Wow. That was good. Well, I'm not going to say good timings of all these things. But
interesting. And sometimes it's therapeutic to also to weave in stuff of your own.
Definitely. It's interesting because actors do that. And I guess it's all just creativity, tapping into what you know.
Yeah, emotionally. What you understand. Exactly.
Yeah. You clearly did a lot of research. Some of your titles on your website, where you list the research, intrigued me. Lost London, The London Rich, Queen Bees, Everybody Was So Young. Which book or books did you find the most inspiring for you to write this story?
I mean, actually, Everybody Was So Young is brilliant. The ones that I found most sort of revelatory were probably the ones about the south of France, because I just didn't know so much about that. And there's another one, Living Well is the Best Revenge, which is such a good title, which is again about that period and this couple, Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who kind of set up this avant-garde life in the south of France in the 20s.
It's a true one, that one.
Yeah. They're all good. The one I thought that was very interesting for me was I think it's called Britain at War, or Britain at War, which was a really brilliant look at Britain at war in the Second World War. And it was really fascinating to see the details of how people lived out life, 5 years of life. People could have 3 children in that time. There was so much day-to-day grind that happened under the auspices of war. And one thinks of it when you look, oh my God, living in war must have been bombs dropping and husbands. But actually there was a lot of it that was quite sort of mundane, wearing, exhaustingly repetitive, which I hadn't really clocked. And I found that really interesting to kind of read about and kind of weave in. I tried to weave into the kind of wartime bit, this sort of exhaustion of being a mother with sons away, or of running a house with kind of rationing and all those kind of things, even if it's a big house like Harriet was. So I found that fascinating. It's well worth a read.
Yeah, you did that. And also how life just kind of goes on as usual. You know, people are working, they're going for a drink after work in London. I was like, I guess you just keep on. Some people just kept on doing what they already did if they didn't have to go to the shelters and there was a pause.
Yeah, life
in the
carried
bombing.
on. But actually it was very nice also living in London to write that sort of section, because I would go and get my coffee at a break and go and sit in Berkeley Square, where she ended up having her flat. And that whole area around there was really kind of would have been like humming in the war, particularly when the Americans came. And that was really fun to sort of look up at streets and think, God, I've just read that this is exactly where the American army, you know, off the generals were here. And they called, I think, Eisenhower Platz, because it was just all Americans. And that was really fun to be actually in London as I wrote that and really imagining that.
God. Yeah, I can imagine. Good location, that London library.
Yeah.
And then speaking of books, can you talk about the link between your book and F. Scott Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise, which was his first book, I guess, and came out in 1920?
Yes. I mean, in a way, it was the title that got me. And I was thinking this whole idea of the gilded life of the rich, and this is the flip side. And I think that was what Fitzgerald was always sort of exploring. Right. You know, the rotten side of you know, and the same, the beautiful and the damned, I think, and I guess in Gatsby. And so I wanted to sort of have a nod to that period and definitely the period when Scott Fitzgerald was writing, and to Tender is the Night, really, by another, just to get people to sort of think about that time possibly.
And even without that, the title's great.
Good. It's hard. Titles for books is a hard thing, you know, it doesn't always come. Some they come and some I think they don't.
So you thought of the title.
So it was very interesting. Originally in my head, was called The Boys, which is quite interesting because for me, it felt like it was a lot about her boys, and she calls them The Boys. And my agent, when we sort of, you know, were going through it, and she said, oh, by the way, you can't call it The Boys because there's another book that's coming out that's just been optioned by Spielberg, and it's about something entirely different. It's about, I think there's a group of boys in a high school in somewhere, but she said, you can't be going head to head. So then we really had to think about a title, and actually it's very hard going back to the beginning, and, you know, and so we sat around. Actually, my agent was incredibly helpful, my editor, and we went through loads of ideas, and then The Other Side of Paradise really struck, and we all agreed on it, which was a good sign.
Yeah. No, I think it's perfect. It's really good. Let's see. What do you want readers to take away from your novel?
That is a very good question. I suppose one always hopes, I guess, with historical fiction, that they can relate. And so whilst Jean Buckman might seem, from the little extract I read, on paper, she's this, you know, character who, you know, wreathed in wealth and all of this, but that actually there's a human connection to her story, and that readers will get inside her kind of head and her heart and be transported. I really hoped that would be the case, that it was more than just a novel about, you know, the sort of Downton Abbey comparison. I wanted it to be so much more than that, to be a real sort of have real heart and soul, I suppose, is what I always want, to move people, make them cry.
I thought it was very that, because you do her interior life, you know, you're always aware of what she's thinking. I think the whole book is from her perspective.
Yes, really, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you accomplished that. And I have a question. So this is your first book. You were a longtime editor and a literary agent. What made you make the leap into, or did you always want to be a writer?
I think I was a massive bookworm from the moment I could read. I just didn't stop reading. And I had two older brothers who were just sporty and never read a book. And it meant that I was constantly like the ball girl holding a book, or the wicket keeper holding a book. So my whole childhood was reading. And so I was gravitated always to books. And now when I think back at university, I used to love writing essays, and lots of my friends would be like, oh, why do you like writing essays? And I really loved writing them and curating them and things. So I think it was always there, but I sort of danced around it by working with writers. And I loved editing for that sense of getting right into a story and helping them. But the sort of the tipping into the actually doing it myself was kind of part life. Like I had set up my agency with this great friend of mine, and we'd done it for a while, but then I had two kids in like back-to-back quick succession, and I couldn't do it. So I took a pause, and the pause lasted about 5 minutes. I was like, oh my God, I can't be at home. I need to do something. And so it felt like that was a moment to sort of take a bit of a risk. And my husband was incredibly supportive. And when I told him, he was like, go for it, because everyone knows it's not a quick route to money. And then actually in doing it, when I first started writing, and I had that moment when I wrote that first scene, I found it so rewarding, so hard, but so fulfilling. And I suddenly was like, maybe this is actually what I really want to do. And the moments when you're right in the flow and you're writing is the best feeling. But getting into that flow, I find very hard. But when so I think I've sort of gradually found my way to the thing I love doing. by quite a long route.
Fantastic. Do you have any advice for first-time authors?
I think for fiction, I would say there's so much advice. I think I would just say you've got to do it in a sustained way. You cannot pick it up and put it down. Mm-hmm. And obviously, not everyone has luxury. You might be writing, with a job as well. Then you've got to do it every day, an hour a day, or if it's 45 minutes a day, or if you're lucky to have 2 hours a day. But I think to sort of pick it up and put it down doesn't work. And for me, that was the thing. It only moved forward when I really, really went back to it. And even on days when I was like, oh, this is impossible, or I was in a foul mood, or nothing happened, go back and edit what you wrote the day before and push it forward incrementally till you've got a draft. That would be my advice. It's hard.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, that was what I interviewed an author, Annabelle Monaghan, who writes romantic comedies. And she said the same thing. She said, if you wait too long, you lose the thread of it. You have
and the
to do something
of it.
every day.
Yes. And I think you also lose touch. I used to find, because obviously with kids, suddenly holidays come and you're like, you can't just, and also sustain concentration in a day. And I would find it really hard sometimes that you'd almost lose, your head would come up for air, and then you sort of lose touch with your characters a bit.
Right.
When you're really in it, you're really feeling them. And often I found that anything I'd read or even listen to, or a song, would connect me to what was going on in the novel, or I'd spot things. And then actually if you spend too much time away from that, you from the novel, then you lose all that. You're suddenly not in it. But it's getting harder, weirdly, I find, as my children get older, not easier.
Oh, what? It's getting harder.
Harder to sort of sustain. Yeah, I suppose when they're tiny in a way, they don't, now the problems grow with children, and you have to be, they want you more than a person. When they're little, they don't really know.
Oh, yeah, of course. How old are your children?
They are 11, 10, and 7.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great but demanding age.
But they were, the sweetest thing of all actually was how unbelievably thrilled they were that the book came out. They were like, my 7-year-old is like a sort of PR woman. She accosts people in our local bookshop. Oh, have you read my mother's book? It's very embarrassing.
That's sweet.
Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah, exactly.
And tell us what you're working on now.
So this is much more based on fact, but I hope sort of compelling fiction. So there's a very famous, well, particularly in England maybe, but maybe in America, a spy called Kim Philby. So he was English spy, but spying for the Russians all the while. And he ended up defecting to Russia in the 60s. And it sort of tore apart the English establishment because he was on paper so proper and everything, but he committed his heart to the Russians in the 20s. Anyway, lots has been written about him, endless biographies by men, but he actually had 4 wives, fascinating wives, and no one's really bothered to sort of see it or imagine it or really write that much about them or their story. And they have fascinating stories about their perspective on him. So it's called Mrs. Philby, and it's the fictionalized story of those 4 wives and their kind of relationship with him.
Did they know he was a spy? Any of them?
So the first one got him into spying. So she was a Austrian Jew, and he married her, and then she had to sort of disappear, and she sort of set him on his path. The second one didn't know at all. English, had his 5 kids. And then in an amazing 5 kids, I don't know how she did that. And she, in a brilliant sort of twist, she is onto him. Suddenly she sort of she's onto the truth. And MI6 and everyone have cleared him, and she believes him. And very tragically, she dies not being vindicated. And he moves on, marries this really cool American woman who's the wife of a New York Times foreign correspondent. And they live this happy life in Beirut. And one day during their sort of, he's drinking a lot and things are seemingly quite confusing. And then he literally disappears and he's gone to Russia. And she follows him for a bit. And then he basically gaslights her. So that's her story, which is fascinating. Wow. And then the 4th wife is like a Russian who is almost the sort of, for me, the kind of, she's like his gatekeeper and allows me to sort of explore whether what he did was worth it, because she's kind of, she grew up under communist, in the regime and stuff. And so there's really interesting material. Yeah. But it's really ultimately, I think, if my first one was about sort of motherhood, this is really about marriage. And there's a lot of sort of similarities in spying and marriage. And, you tell yourself the person you marry, you know everything about them. You tell them they're the person for you. You tell yourself they're the person for you. And then as it all unravels, and you learn more. It's quite sort of interesting to explore, I think.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay. That sounds great.
So that I'm deep into marriage and spying at the moment. I might have to dedicate this one to my husband as well.
Yeah. So my last question is, are you reading any great books now? Probably a lot of spy novels, I'm guessing.
So a lot of stuff, exactly. But for relief, I literally finished it last week, was the Curtis Sittenfeld, the new short stories, Show Don't Tell, which I love.
I haven't read them yet.
I love her.
I do too.
She's brilliant. And actually she is very interesting for me because like The American Wife, did you read that?
Yes.
Which was Bush's wife's story. Was it Laura Bush? And I thought that was so clever, the kind of weaving of fact and fiction, and also with Rodham, which I loved.
Yeah, I loved.
About Hillary. So I like the way she can do that with real stories and things like that. But I just find her very funny. I mean, I was laughing out loud a lot.
She's really good. And I like Prep, her very first one.
Loved Prep. That was the first one, exactly.
Yeah. So this one, it's short stories.
Yeah. So it's like 10 short stories, really all about.
I get it.
And one, she goes back to the school in Prep and that character, but looking back later, it's very good. And it's a lot about growing older, old women getting older and marriage and life. And it's good. It's very good.
Good. Yeah, she is funny. Well, that's it for my questions. Thank you so much. I think this will definitely further enhance anybody reading the book, listening they'll love the book even more.
Thank you.
And it is sad. It is sad, but life is not always happy.
Exactly.
You know, it's very real.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I've so enjoyed it. It's lovely talking about it. It's fun.
Thank you for listening to the show. I thought Vanessa was very insightful about writing what you know, houses as character, and for fiction writers, being disciplined, writing every day, even if you don't feel like it, so that you stay connected to your story. If you enjoyed the show and would like to read this book, please purchase it through the Amazon link in my show notes, and that will help support the show. Thanks so much, and see you in 2 weeks.